Hello, welcome. My name is John Butler, and I'm the Investment Director at Southbank Investment Research. I'm joined today by my colleague James Allen to discuss the situation in the energy markets today, which, let's face it, energy has become the hot topic, pun fully intended, when it comes to investing. We've seen multiple years of dislocations in the energy markets. We've seen oil prices drop below zero in the United States, only to come roaring back into the near triple digits for a time. We've seen, of course, a war breakout in Eastern Europe, and Europe's largest nuclear power plant has been in the crossfire between Ukraine and Russian forces on multiple occasions. We've seen Germany and California, among other major advanced economic areas of the world, face rolling blackouts due to a lack of reliable base power generation under certain extreme yet occasional conditions. And so, James is here to talk us through where the big opportunities lie in the energy markets in 2023. Welcome, James.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
To kick off our discussion, I would like to think that we frame it a bit. And here in the UK specifically, the challenges faced by energy and energy policy are normally characterized as a trilemma. That is, we're solving for the optimal mix of energy affordability, security, and of course, sustainability. We don't want to be damaging or destroying the planet in the process of making energy affordable and secure. So given that backdrop, and given the fact that already back in 2021, Professor Jonathan Clark of Warwick University, he's an expert on the topic, he was already characterizing the UK as facing an energy crisis. And that's before some of the events I just rattled off even took place. We're clearly in a worse situation today than we were in 2021. How did we get here? Who's to blame? How is it going to get fixed? How much is it going to how much is it going to cost? And how long is it going to take?
Yeah, right. So we have to remember back in 2021, this is obviously before the war started, we're already seeing Russia weaponize natural gas. They're already restricting flows into Europe. We were seeing Chinese demand roaring back after the pandemic, which was lifting prices, and we're seeing some quite odd things with the weather. That was all having an effect on fuel prices. But to answer your point about that sort of trilemma, I think obviously UK has increasingly moved to sustainable energy, green energy over the last few years, and I would say two of those three of that trilemma, if not three, are all pointing in the right direction or have pointed in the right direction. We had a big scale up of clean energy 20 years ago, and that was mainly based on the sustainability angle. You know, we're moving into clean energy because it was the only sustainable choice. 10 years ago, when the cost of clean energy started to come down, it was an economic perspective, an economic driving force to push the next wave of clean energy, and that has enabled a lot more sort of clean energy to come onto the grid. Now, it's the last component, security, has been the major challenge. Now, I do think solar, for example, offers big sort of security supply benefits, but I think it's fair to say we're not fully there 100% right now. I think that's fair to say. We still don't really have a long duration battery, for example, so we can't just completely add increasing amounts of renewable energy, solar energy onto the grid, because we can't cater for those times for multiple hours, if not days, when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow. So that's where we are right now. So that's the situation. I think that will be solved. That battery dilemma will be solved over the next few years, but we're not there now. And I think that has opened the door. Over the last couple of years, security supply has ramped up the agenda. We've seen that before and in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. And this is the challenge right now, and that has, I guess, made the energy transition maybe a bit messier than I think we all probably thought it might have gone 5 years ago. If nothing else has shown us over the last year or so, is that this energy transition is going to be a bumpy ride. I think we will get there, or a lot of where we need to be over the next few years. But right now, I think with security of the supply increasing up that agenda, I think that has opened the door for some short-term opportunities, I guess, in what we might call old energy, in oil and gas, I think. And I think that's been what we've seen. We've seen China not just oil and gas. China's upped its coal use, for example. We've also seen a bit of that in Europe. Coal has come back into play. We've seen investors really sort of scale down some of their sort of climate change objectives, and they've started to invest a bit more into fossil fuels. So I think that's the state of play right now. I think this state of play will probably remain over the next couple of years, if not a bit longer, I think. And I think we'll get to the promised land in terms of energy transition. We'll get back on track in due course. But right now, I think the short-term security and supply considerations are paramount.
Well, certainly, right? I mean, as you frequently say, we want to go green, but we don't want to go dark before we go green. And certainly the darkness has been of concern for several years. And before the war in Ukraine, see, this is the key point, and this is why I cited Professor Clark from 2021. The fact is that as I characterize it, overpromising and under-delivering of alternative green energy was evident already several years ago. And the Ukraine war is just making a bad situation worse. So let's not blame that on what was a fundamental problem that was becoming increasingly apparent already several years ago. Now, hold on. So the thing is this, your confidence is reassuring, and we all want to be optimistic for the future. But the future might be 10, 20, 50, or 100 years away. In the meantime, as investors, clearly, we need to go where the action is. We need to go where the money is actually going to be made. And as you say, this, surprising to some, perhaps not to others, falling back on what we know actually works, even if it's dirty brown lignite coal in East Germany, that's kind of where the action has been of late. And as you say, maybe it will remain so for years.
Can I just pick up on one point there? You say, I think where we went wrong, actually, I think David Cameron cut that green crap 10, 15 years ago when he slashed levies for energy efficiency. Now that's been proved now. If we had kept some of those levies on board now, that would be taking, our retail bills would have come a lot further down. I think that was a big mistake that we didn't actually put in a proper energy efficiency drive to help insulate us from these soaring gas prices. And we have to remember, this is a gas price problem we've seen in the UK. We can't hide behind that. This is not a renewable problem. We've got to remember where we would be without renewables on the grid. The renewables have been pretty much the only thing keeping our bills down, actually, our wholesale costs down. But I do take your point. I think, as I said, energy transition has had a bumpy year or so. We've seen, the clean tech markets had a phenomenal sort of 2019, 2020, early part of 21, and they've collapsed, to all intents and purposes. There's some interesting things going on right now, but we've had a big sell-off, and investors are moving increasingly back into fossil fuels. And this situation, I don't think will necessarily last forever. But I think there are certainly some interesting investment opportunities right now in what you might call old energy. I think we just have to be open-minded and honest about this. What we're seeing in Europe, Europe has lost a huge proportion of its natural gas supply. I think before the war, Russia was supplying 40% of our natural gas. Right now, it's 9%. So that is a huge amount of natural gas, and a lot of that gas is going to be substituted by other sources of gas. LNG from the US or wherever. So there are investment opportunities in natural gas and other sort of fossil fuels, but I do think over the long-term perspective, I think renewables are still a very good bet indeed. I think right now we're seeing this sort of a clash or a collision really between our short-term needs, energy security supply, and our long-term needs to get as much sort of to meet our climate change objectives and to trying to decarbonise our grid. So it's creating a market right now where sort of everything is to play for, I think. I think there's good investment opportunities right now in both old and new energy.
Well, I think that's a good way to characterize it. That is, everything is to play for right now. And you mentioned a moment ago that that one reason why we're in the mess we're in is because the UK, in fact, hasn't spent enough in trying to power forward to an energy transition. And so we don't have, as you say, the efficiencies we would otherwise have had we spent more and sooner and faster. But the fact is that it seems to me that the idea that somehow by spending more we're going to solve our energy problems, let's face it, right? Taxation is already at a record high in this country. The national debt is at a record high. The country's running deficits. The same is true for essentially all of Europe. And are we really in a position to spend even more money on something that hasn't yet worked? I mean, is doubling down really the right thing to do, or do we just have to accept that we're going to have to rely on a lot more fossil and or nuclear for a lot longer than we thought, and we might want to consider getting our economic house in order before we splurge on the next big green energy trend idea, whatever it might be?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we had to put this in perspective. Green levies right now add on about £150 onto a retail consumer's electricity bill. That is the sum total. If we look where energy bills are right now, it's not an insignificant amount, but by no means is this the driving force of what we're paying each month. So, and actually, if we look at the components of these levies, the UK has a big CFD market to really trying to incentivise some renewable capacity to come onto the grid, and it's all based on a strike price, a minimum amount where the government will guarantee the price of energy so that we can get some low carbon source onto the grid. When it first started, actually, renewable generators were receiving top-up payments, so that it was an expense on the treasury. Actually, since 2021, it's gone the other way because the wholesale price has been higher than that minimum amount. The Treasury is making billions from renewable generators. This is actually saving each UK taxpayer £50 a year, and this is happening right now. So we can't lie. Of course, there are subsidies. We have got a legacy system based predominantly on oil and gas. And we need to try and incentivise generators to get some low carbon generation onto the grid. But actually, in the last couple of years, it's actually been cost effective for the governments to run these schemes. And we can't lie. Also, oil and gas, they have subsidies for tax breaks for extraction. They have there's a capacity market in the UK for power generation, which actually gives subsidies for firm generation. Actually, coal has been receiving some of these subsidies in the UK right now. So I think subsidies are a fact of life. I think a lot of energy infrastructure, whether it's old or new, receive subsidies in one shape or form or another. So I think increasing over time, we'll wean ourselves off these subsidies. I mean, the cost of solar power now, I think it's about 30. In 2021, Lansard did a study. It's $38 a megawatt hour. It's the cheapest form of electricity. This is the lifetime costs of solar. The cheapest form of electricity anywhere ever in the world. Wind was a bit higher. Gas was about $50 or $60 a megawatt hour. Coal was 100. This obviously the prices have all changed now, or the costs have all changed now since the war. But that's been the direction of travel. We've seen a huge decrease in renewable costs, and I think we're having a bit of a bump in the road. Like all sort of energy sources, costs have gone up a little bit over the last couple of years with inflation. But I think we will get back onto that trend of decreasing costs. The big missing piece of this puzzle, I think, to really drive the next scale of wind and solar renewables will be that battery, that long duration battery, which will enable increasing amounts of wind and solar to be put onto the grid. The battery can then act as a bit of a power generator. But this doesn't mean to say we're there yet, and it also doesn't mean to say that there are no opportunities in non-renewable sources. Nuclear power, for example. There's a huge opportunity now for nuclear to provide some of that base load power, and likewise some other sources. Gas will still remain part of the UK energy mix for the foreseeable. We can't hide behind that. We've got to replace some of this Russian gas, and there's some very interesting opportunities. As someone who's advocated for green energy, I've always been honest about the challenges involved. I've actually run an investment newsletter service back in the day, which promoted some oil and gas stocks. And I think actually now it's come back into vogue. I think we should be open-minded as investors to go really where the money is. And right now there are some shorter-term opportunities. I would say predominantly in the gas markets in Europe, and also in other regions actually as well.
Well, certainly, opportunities abound whenever there are problems that need to be solved. I wonder sometimes, you mentioned subsidies for this, that, and the other thing. One wonders if, whether the government is actually the problem here in some cases. That is, why is energy so unique? Why can't the government just step back and allow the free market to work its magic? Now, I understand that when it comes to issues of security, in particular national security, okay, fine. You can see how there is this need to have energy independence to some degree. But when you start micromanaging managing things to the extent that the government has in recent years to try and push its green agenda with all the politicization and all the lobbying funds and all the special interest that draws in, you wonder if it's leading efficiently and rationally in the directions that you clearly state we kind of do need to go. But let's leave that aside, because we know that anything that the government gets its fingers into is probably going to be at least somewhat suboptimal. But hey, what are the alternatives? That's what we've got at the moment, right? Well, turning outside the UK a bit and thinking a bit more globally, let's face it, the UK is only about, what, 4 or 5% of the global economy. And in terms of energy generation, it might even be a smaller share than that, because we import a lot from EDF in France and North Sea gas and what else from around Netherlands, Norway, and so on. So the UK really is just an energy price taker from the rest of the world. And not to say we shouldn't have a certain degree of energy security and independence, but when it comes to how much that's going to cost, it's pretty much a global price. And as you say, China, India, Brazil, the big developing, emerging, or largely emerged in some cases, economies of the world, they're just doing what works. They don't care if it's coal, they don't care if it's gas, they don't care if it's nuclear. In fact, they're happy to do any and all of the above. And their attitude is understandable. They want to catch up. And if anything, they want to leapfrog where we've ended up, to some extent tied up in knots with unreliable or not enough reliable base power. At certain times of the year, whatever it might be. So, I mean, when you look at that, I mean, isn't there tremendous opportunity when you look around the world?
I completely agree. I mean, as I said, this energy transition means different things to different peoples in different regions. It's been disjointed. The global south, China, India, they've actually also, they're doing good things in renewables as well. I mean, China's doing phenomenal things in wind and solar, as India as well. But we can't lie. They've also increasing their coal use as well. They have to be realistic about the challenges involved. I do think the developed world could probably do more for the global south in terms of access to cheap finance to help them with the energy transition. Right now, I think there are interesting opportunities, obviously, for the global south to really, we know the security supply issues. They are putting more fossil fuels onto their own grids, and I think that will probably remain for the next few years. So, as an investor, if you want to go where the money is, that's probably a good place to look at. But equally, I'd also say that they're also doing a bit of an all of the above strategy. They are also, certainly China is probably the leader in the world, really, in terms of renewable energy. They're for geopolitical reasons, for sustainability reasons, they really are pushing ahead. They really have developed that value chain for battery metals into solar and into wind. They're driving some of the energy transition for a lot of the world, really. So there's opportunities there for, that sums up everything, really. There's opportunities everywhere, all at once in the global south. I mean, they don't have some of the political compromises or the political agendas that we struggle with and battle. It's not really part of their culture wars as energy is sort of here. So as an investor, it's not a bad place to look, really. I think there's increasingly exciting opportunities, India and China specifically, I think.
Well, you mentioned these very large countries, and you mentioned that they're also interested in battery technology. But let's face it, if every household in the world had a battery capable of storing enough energy for, a day, a week, a month, whatever it is, from whatever source the energy ultimately comes, doesn't that take a lot of metal? I mean, aren't we going to literally deplete Africa of all remaining metal ores that exist in the Congo or elsewhere to build all of these batteries for all the billions of people that are now inhabiting the planet?
I think there's a lot of, you can find a study to back up your opinion here about how much actually metals or how much, consumption or how much supply there is actually of some of these battery metals. I do think, we do have a relatively short or 5 to 10 years, there's been a lack of investment in some of these battery metals. I think with the demand projections for some of these EVs, for example, considering how much lithium, for example, is coming out of the ground, I think there's a bit of a disconnect. I think that will potentially slow down the energy transition.
But how much is even in the ground? By some estimates, we're going to run out of this stuff.
Other estimates suggest there's absolutely plenty, I think. And we have to be realistic. the same should apply for oil and gas, really. I mean, that's also a finite resource, and we've used up a lot of the easy, cheaper, accessible resources there. I mean, there's no one perfect panacea now. Every fuel type, every energy source has its challenges, has its problems. But I think, we do need higher prices in probably some of these battery metals to incentivize some more supply to come out of the ground. I do think, from what I understand, what I know, there should be enough battery metals in the ground to certainly power the huge uptake in EVs and batteries we're going to see. But I know there is debate on that source, but I would certainly think there's huge investment opportunities. Really,
well, that's the takeaway, isn't it? Because regardless of just how limited this stuff is, the fact is there aren't enough holes being dug in the ground right now. There aren't even enough holes being planned to be dug in the ground right now, the world over, to supply anything like the forecast demand for the metals that are needed to even remotely begin to get the battery networks to where they would need to be to provide for anything close to the sort of transition that we want to make in the developed world, much less the developing. So that to me seems almost a no-brainer. Yep. That is, you need some exposure to this sector, regardless of just how much ore is in the ground, one way or the other. But leaving metals aside and batteries aside for a moment, again, as I mentioned a moment ago, look, the actual energy for the battery, or whatever it is, has to come from somewhere. And you mentioned, of course, that all these resources are finite. Well, if there's one resource that the Earth has, which, fine, might be finite in an absolute physical universal sense, but in practical terms, on any time horizon that any of us think about, is effectively infinite, that's uranium.
Right.
I mean, by some estimates, proven reserves of uranium, even allowing for modest electrical demand, power demand expansion over the coming generations, is going to last for literally thousands of years. Proven reserves. I mean, we haven't even gone looking over the whole planet for uranium yet. Does that not really mean that ultimately the energy transition, to truly be sustainable long term, is going to have a huge and growing nuclear component indefinitely?
I would answer into the positive for that question. I think yes, I think nuclear power has a very important role in the energy transition. I think nuclear has been in the doldrums over the last decade. Uranium stocks have gone nowhere really, and yet now we've seen a resurgence. And I think it's a very safe. I think there's lots of misnomers about various nuclear accidents in the past, Chernobyl, Fukushima. Actually, if you look at the real detail, most of the accidents or most of the deaths really weren't a direct consequence of actually of the uranium or the radioactive waste. Really, it's very quite actually rare. Certainly compared to coal mines and anything like that in terms of deaths from nuclear versus coal. I think there's incredibly exciting opportunities now in nuclear. I think it's a huge mistake that some European countries even put on the table that they were going to retire some of their existing nuclear power plants. And I think there's a new market developing in advanced reactor technology, still centralized technology, maybe not as big, still very flexible nuclear. Likewise, further down the line, potentially in small modular reactors. There's lots of exciting stuff happening in the UK and other markets. That's an exciting investment opportunity as well. But I think we're all clear really. We do need some form of nuclear in that power mix, across the world really. And I think that's why investors over the last year really turned their attention back towards nuclear stocks, whether it's uranium or across the whole supply chain of a nuclear plant. There's in lots of ways to play it. I think that's an ongoing theme. I think that's every energy investor should look to get some sort of nuclear exposure in their portfolio, I'd say.
Well, I think it's a real historical signpost that Japan, I mean, you mentioned Fukushima. Even Japan now has come around to realizing that notwithstanding, that tragedy, they just have no choice. And they have to set about building additional, not just restoring previous nuclear capacity, but building out additional nuclear capacity. So when Japan comes full circle on this one, Europe's own goal, as it were, Germany giving up on nuclear is seen for what it was, something they shouldn't have done.
Yep.
And so one European country after another is also realizing that they just have to stick with nuclear indefinitely. So that does seem a fantastic opportunity, which brings me to the big question. If you had to sort of say right now, if you had to, take your money, take your investments and say, what energy sector am I going to overweight on a reasonable time horizon? Let's say 1 to 3 years maximum. So not the long term, not the post-transition period, but more immediately. What's your favorite and why?
Wow, that's a tough question because I do want to be loyal to my green energy roots in some ways. Of course, there's lots of exciting things happening in the US. The Inflation Reduction Act should be a real game changer for some renewable stocks over there. I think it will probably be a longer term. We'll see a longer term performance, I guess. I think right now, for a slightly shorter term horizon, I think natural gas is probably where we look at. I think the natural gas price got to a very expensive level last year, about 300 euros a megawatt hour. It then has collapsed now down to below 50, which is actually cheaper than it was before the war. But now we're in a situation where our stocks are in a good shape, but we still do need to refill them without any Russian gas, really, ahead of next winter. And now China's back in the party. China, they had lockdowns before. They'll now be increasingly competing for some of these LNG volumes. So as I say, gas is a global market. So I think there's potential good upside in the gas markets, I think, over the next few months. So that has, there's lots of ways to play this. Outright buying a gas contract, or LNG exporters, another exciting way to play that. So that would be, for a shorter term trade, as you like, that would probably be an exciting way to look at it. I did a similar type of trade in one of my services last year. I thought the gas price had got too expensive, and effectively we did a proxy trade saying we're going short natural gas, and that proved pretty successful. Now I think we're getting to the point where we can flip that and go long natural gas. So and all the associated LNG exporters as well. That'd be a good way to play it.
Well, the gas market's fascinating, and as you say, particularly so at the moment. But one has to keep in mind this is a very volatile market. This is a very seasonal market.
Yep.
And if you're going to get involved, you've got to be nimble and flexible as you move through the year and as conditions warrant. So in principle, I'm absolutely with you, but I want you to be updating your views on a regular basis going forward.
Well, yeah, and I've had to sort of, my views have we have got to be realistic about what's happened the last couple of years. I'm a long-term bull on energy transition, on green energy stocks. That is not going away. That opportunity is still there, still on the table. But some fossil fuel energy has come back to the party over the last couple of years, and I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. You might say, would I like it to go away? Maybe I might answer yes, but we have to be realistic. Lots of countries have turned back towards fossil fuels, and they're probably going to keep looking at fossil fuels while security of supply has gone to the top of the agenda. I think that's realistic, and at the same time, whilst battery tech isn't quite where we need it to be. So I think this creates an opportunity, whether it's 2 years, 5 years, however long, for us to play on a resurgence, I guess, in fossil fuel investments. I'm still a long-term bull on clean energy, 100%. But there's more than one way to skin a cat here. There's more than one way, more than one investment opportunity here, and I think we can be realistic. We can play a shorter-term type investment on fossil fuels, I would say, and a longer-term, big, huge investment megatrend in the energy transition.
Well, as we've discussed before, we're both big fans of human ingenuity, technology, and the ability that we have as thinking human beings, sentient beings, to solve problems over time, be they natural or be they man-made. Oddly enough, I think that the current set of energy challenges that we have are as much man-made as they are natural, as previously discussed. But maybe that's a good way to end it here. That is, we should remain optimistic. We should remain invested in the longer term. However, we absolutely should not lose sight of the opportunities presented by short-term, here and now, real challenges that arguably can only be solved by stepping back on what's known and proven in the world of energy. So thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with most of that. Yeah, we have to be realistic. There's some short-term challenges that we need to address, creates opportunities for investors. At the same time, there's a huge investment opportunity over the long term, which hopefully we can all agree on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining me, James. I'm sure our viewers have appreciated your thoughts, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks, John.